shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
A very good morning to you from a beautifully wet and raining Gloucestershire. It is Saturday the 29th of August 2026. This is the Saturday Breakfast Show here on Teachers Talk Radio. I am your host, Darren Lester. Good morning. How are you? How are you doing? How has your week been? I hope it's been a good one, especially for those of you who have been making the most of a final week off of school before we head back into the autumn term. Can't believe that we're about to go into the autumn term already. This year has flown. The calendar year 2026 has gone by so quickly. But yeah, I hope that you've had a good week. I hope that whatever you've been doing to relax, to make the most of it, has been enjoyable, has been recharging. I hope that you feel that your cup is filled. I've been doing results analysis this week. So not exactly the most relaxing job in the world, but quite sadly, I do think it's very interesting. I'm not a stats person at all. I'm not a numbers person. I'm very much a words person. And so when we kind of reduce results down to the facts and figures, I do find it quite difficult, if I'm honest, because it doesn't take into account all of the individual stories behind each individual result, which I think is really interesting. But of course, when you are doing that on a national scale to get ready for conversations that you might be having with your department, with your line managers, whoever that might be, you don't know all of the individual stories. You only know the numbers that are published right there in front of you. But I will say, I'm not going to say very much because actually the reason that I did this is not for my own meetings at all, but it's for some CPD that I'm going to present in a couple of weeks' time. But across my subjects, across languages, across classics, I will say that this year's uptake especially, but the result stats in general are skewing very positively, which I'm really happy about. So it has made for a less depressing week of results analysis than I've done in the past. But I'm not going to count my chickens before they hatch, because we all know that exam uptake, subject study uptake depends on cohorts, it depends on individual interests, it depends on whatever is trending at the time that they pick their options, whatever the current, or this is what I have to do when I grow up, this is what I have to study at university message is. But yeah, I was really buoyed by looking at the stats for MFL and for classics for this year. And so I'm hoping that I will be able to ride that energy into September, into the brand new academic year, because we're going to take whatever positives, whatever wins we can get. So hopefully, whatever kind of a week you have had, it has been as uplifting and as positive as mine was. If my old maths teacher from secondary school could hear me talking about finding bar charts and statistics as being uplifting and positive, she'd be having a field day. Because safe to say, maths was never my favorite subject in school. I was good at it. I can do it. I just didn't enjoy it particularly. It was the only lesson that I ever got into trouble in. I think I've told this story on the show before, so forgive me if I have, but I'm going to regale you with it anyway. It was the day of my GCSE German oral. I had a maths lesson in the morning. My German exam was in the afternoon. We were in a kind of study period anyway. It was a case where content across all subjects had finished, and so we were just revising. So I was sitting in my maths lesson, revising for my German exam, which was that afternoon, and I thought was perfectly reasonable because it was that afternoon. Um, my maths teacher told me to put my German stuff away and get my maths stuff out because it was a maths lesson, and so I should be revising maths, which, with my teacher hat on, I think is a reasonable request for her to have made, even though I still maintain that I was right in wanting to study for the exam that I had that afternoon, but that's by the by. And I argued with her. It's the only time that I ever argued with any of my teachers. I think just because I was feeling stressy about the exam that I had that afternoon. And she threatened to send me out of the classroom, which was the only time that that I had been been threatened with getting into trouble when I was at school. I was mortified. I was mortified, and I was sorry that I had very clearly upset my teacher, to the extent that she felt that she might have to punish me. But I still maintain that I was right in using that lesson to revise for an exam that I had that day, instead of an exam that was happening in a nebulous future. But yeah, I was one of those goody goody kids at school. I was the one. I didn't like to get into trouble. I believed in doing what my teachers asked of me because they were my teachers, and I just believed in, even if I didn't enjoy the subjects that I was doing, even if I didn't have any intention of carrying on with them in my future learning, I appreciated the opportunities that I had to learn. So I do feel quite proud of myself. I got through pretty much my whole educational career and only got into trouble in that one lesson on that one day. That's always quite good. But I do look back on it and I am a little bit mortified about how I spoke to my teacher on that day. So I am terribly sorry. I'm also very sorry that I don't remember your name, miss. But if you should be happening to listen to this show, which I very highly doubt, but if you are, please know that I'm very, very sorry how I acted in that lesson. Um, don't worry about it. Don't worry. We're just kind of riffing a little bit before we get into the show proper. We've not touched on our topic yet. I was just talking about statistics to start with, talking about how um, it's a funny old world that we end up in, where 30 years down the line you might find yourself actually enjoying something that you really did not enjoy when you were at school, because of the kind of picture that it paints. Today's topic, since we are kind of veering in that direction, is going back to school, going back to work, and how we are feeling about it. So I did a companion show to this one back in January. It was actually my first show of the year of 2026, and it was called It's Like We Were Never Away. I've popped a QR code up on the screen for those of you who are watching. So if you are on YouTube or you are on X, and you've got me up on your screen, you can scan that QR code and hopefully it will take you over to that show. So go over to the show, hit pause, as I always say, so that you don't miss this one. But it might be worth having a bit of a listen to. Um, that show was predominantly about the benefits of having a holiday. So, why it's important to take them, why it's important that we do step away, that we do recharge. Because we know as teachers that one of the talking points that is often levied against us is this idea that we get so many holidays, too many holidays. Teachers are always on holiday. And the rebuttal to that quite often, and I've done this myself, is to turn around and say, yes, but I work through my holidays. It's not actually a holiday, it's a work from home day. It's a work when I'm in my classroom, but the kids aren't there day. It's taking back time because of all the Saturdays that I spent marking and planning day. And we tend to argue against this idea that we have lots of holidays. And I think that we should keep pushing back against this idea that we have, in inverted commas, lots of holidays, because mostly we do work through them. And it's one of the things that I've spoken about before on the show, and I've spoken about in lots of places. There is this idea that because everybody has been to school, or the vast majority of people have been to school, they know what teachers' lives are like. And there is this perception that because when people went to school, they had lots of holidays, because as kids you do, that teachers have the same thing. And I think unless we have the conversations and unless we're very honest and say, well, actually, no, we're still working. It's just that the kids aren't around. We do have things to do outside of being with the children. Um, yeah, if we don't have those conversations, then people aren't going to know, because it's very reasonable that people don't know the minutiae of other people's jobs. I go into a supermarket every single week. That doesn't mean that I know what the job of the people stacking the shelves, or behind the tills, or out in the back sorting out the stock is. And so if they told me, then I would listen. But I do think that sometimes, and again, this could just be a me problem, um, we do actually forget to take those holidays because we are so busy trying to get caught up, trying to prepare for what's coming. So, it's very, very easy for a half term to slip by and you've worked every single day. I know that I've done that. And then it's very easy for an Easter holiday to come around and you've worked every single day. Again, I've done that. And if you're not very careful, it's very, very easy to get to the summer holiday and to realize that actually you haven't had a break, you haven't had a holiday since the previous summer, and you've got some work to do during the summer holidays, because we always do. And it's very easy for us to actually not take that break, to not make the most of that undirected time. That for many people who work in schools, let's remember, is unpaid time. So it's, not even necessarily like you are working, but at least you're being paid, because lots of school staff are not paid during those holidays. So that's what that show was about. And it was about why we need to remember to take the holiday, and why it feels so far away the moment we go back into school. Today's show, I'm taking a slightly different approach to it, and we're actually looking at what that feeling of going back to work is like. The research that I'm going to draw on today actually doesn't come from teaching. It draws on a wide range of different professions, which I think is really important, because I think each profession is unique, and teaching comes with certain um, idiosyncrasies, let's say, such as how often we do end up going back to work after a holiday, because they come around quite regularly. Um, but because we're all unique, and because we all have idiosyncrasies, we are the same. And so I think it's good sometimes to look at what other professions do, what work comes out of studies of other jobs. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to have a think about what it's like to go back to work, what those feelings are like, and how to deal with those feelings, particularly if you are feeling worried about it, particularly if you are feeling stressed about it. So, as always, if you've got anything to say across the course of the show today, please do. You can message me, just as Teacher Fixel did right at the top of the show there. Always very glad to hear from you, by leaving a comment. If you are here on YouTube or on X, I will pop them up on the screen. I will read them out and we can engage that way. If you are listening to me live elsewhere, then you can message me over on Blue Sky. I am at Mr. D Lester. That's Midlester. all in one word. Again, I will read your comment out and we can engage that way. And similarly, if you are listening via playback, of course, your comment won't make it on air, but I will still engage with you over on Blue Sky because, as I always say, the topics that we talk about here on a Saturday morning are things that I'm always interested in, things that I always think are important. And so I'm always happy to chat with you about them.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Following earlier A-level results and results for pupils in Scotland. This week's news looks at some of the stories linked to results days that you might have missed. The BBC reports on schools who have trialled the use of an app which will allow pupils to see their results on a smartphone. 750 schools in England were involved in the trial. The article features comments from pupils, parents and staff from a school taking part in the trial itself, with one deputy head teacher keen to emphasise his hopes that the app doesn't kill results day. He emphasised the importance of community celebrations, as well as the opportunity to give support to pupils and parents who may need it, particularly if there had been disappointing results. Parents also reported that although the app was good, it shouldn't replace a proper results day. The app allows pupils easy access to a record of the results and is intended to reduce paperwork in the future. A-level results day prompted stories around university places in many media outlets, as UCAS reported that a record number of UK 18-year-olds have been accepted to universities this year. The biggest increase in acceptance was for higher tariff universities, such as those in the Russell Group. The Higher Education Policy Group said the top institutions were hoovering up all the crumbs when it came to top students, even if they hadn't met their offer grades. The Russell Group responded by saying they had always been flexible and that this was not lowering standards. The increase in places comes as the sector continues to struggle financially, and questions have been raised about the cost of university and the overall importance of having a degree. There has been a drop in international students in recent years, so universities appear to be using their resources for UK students instead. Many outlets reported on joy and relief for students who were initially disappointed that they had missed results, but found they had been accepted anyway. Schools Week reports that markers for a language GCSE have raised concerns about having to make judgment calls without enough guidance. Markers for Pearson EdXL have raised the issues after new specifications resulted in a new mark scheme for Spanish, French and German. Markers for GCSE Spanish were particularly concerned, with one marker reporting that they had sent 50 questions on for review, but had only received clarifying responses when they had almost finished marking. Other issues highlighted include the marking process as a whole, as well as pay for those marking exam papers. While in the Channel Islands, the BBC reports that whilst pupils in the bailiwick of Guernsey had a pass rate of 71% for grades 4 and above, maths grades were disappointing and patchy. The president of the Education, Sports and Leisure Committee told reporters that the outcomes would take a while to process, and that school-specific breakdowns for 624 pupils sitting their GCSEs this year would be released in the coming weeks. The figure of 71% of grades 4 and above for GCSE or equivalent is higher than grades across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Finally, results in Scottish Nationals, Highers and Advanced Highers have all increased this year. Those who signed up to text message and email results systems began to receive them at 8 AM on the results day. The National 5 pass rate rose by 0.8% to 79.2%. Highers rose by a similar percentage to 76.7%, and advanced hires up by 0.9% to 77.6%. The 2026 exams were the first series under Scotland's new exams body, Qualifications Scotland, and 148,000 candidates received results. Initial analysis suggests that female students achieved a higher pass rate at all exam levels than their male counterparts, while private schools performed significantly better than state schools. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Thank you, Jo. I will just say, as an MFL teacher, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't. I find it interesting that so much of the news has focused on the remarks made by MFL examiners, and no other subject has been picked up for the same amount of discussion. I cannot believe, as an MFL teacher, I cannot believe that we were the only subject where examiners had something to say about examining, about mark schemes. I know full well that the MFL examiners are not the first people to raise this idea of examiners not being paid enough. And I find it really interesting that the discourse has focused on them, on us as a subject, and on them as the examiners, the markers. Because, and again, I'm not slating the news coverage. I'm absolutely not slating Jo, because she was picking up what is out there in the national discourse. But I find it interesting that in MFL, we perpetually get the negative press. Even when something is framed positively, like examiners are standing up for themselves, examiners are asking for more guidance, examiners are asking for better pay conditions, it's still framed in quite a negative way when it comes to talking about MFL. And if this were just one news story on its own, if languages were never discussed in the UK, if we never ever talked about them, we never ever talked about language education, then, I could accept it. But when you get this kind of perpetual negative image being thrown at you all of the time, pretty much all of the news stories that we get about MFL, all of the ones that are picked up by the media, tends to be the negative stories rather than the positive stories. It does start to grind you down a little bit. And yeah, I just find it quite interesting that it is the MFL cohort who have been picked up for being outspoken about working conditions. And, we haven't heard what the maths teachers, the maths markers, the science markers, the drama markers have had to say. Anyway, that's not what we are here to talk about. We are here to talk about going back after the holiday. I want to start with a little caveat, I suppose, of this show, which is I'm coming to this from a place of believing that it's okay to not want to go back to work. I also come at this from a place of believing that we low-key fall into toxic positivity at this time of year. I saw a meme this morning. I don't know when it was posted, but I happened to see it this morning just before the show started. Posted by a very well-known, very well-respected teacher influencer, somebody that I respect a lot. And it was the good old, it's trotted out every year. Remember, if you're worried about going back to work, there is a child who has spent their whole summer being excited to see you. And I understand the message behind it. I understand that it's supposed to be uplifting, that it's supposed to be a reminder that going back to work isn't a bad thing, that we do it for the kids, But again, as I've talked about on the show before, I do think that sometimes the doing it for the kids mentality is used against us in a way that tries to get us to ignore our own feelings about the job, ignore our own concerns, our own critiques, even just a very natural, oh, it's Monday and I don't want to go back to work. And it can quite often be weaponized against us to suggest that if we have negative feelings about going back to work, then we don't like the kids. We don't like the jobs. We're doing it for the wrong reason. I've spoken at length on the show before about how this isn't unique to us. This is true of all vocations, of all caring professions, where it's quite often used as a justification for not giving us the time, not giving us the pay, not giving us the conditions that we are asking for. And it's, you know, it is very similar to, as I understand it, what the GCSE markers are asking for. You know, they are asking to be compensated fairly. They are asking for more professional development. They are asking for more guidance. And the same idea can be levied at them. You're doing it for the kids. You know, you are doing it because exam results are very important. But I feel that can sometimes be used like emotional blackmail. And like, because you are doing it in a way to care, because you are doing it for these groups that can't necessarily advocate for themselves, that can't stand up for themselves, these groups who need you, then that should be payment enough. You know, why should you get good feelings about helping and a fair wage and time to plan your lessons and not be expected to do unpaid overtime? So, one of the reasons that I want to have this conversation today is just to remind those of you out there who are feeling a bit iffy about going to work next week, and for whom the talking points of you're doing it for the kids don't quite hit. I want you to know that you are not alone, that there are many of us out there, and that the research backs us up. And we are nothing on Saturday Breakfast if we are not research informed. So let's get down to business. Let me sort of introduce this research paper to you. This paper is written by Kaita Souza and Gabriela Gonçalves. I hope that's pronounced correctly. I don't speak Portuguese, so I have tried my best, and my apologies to the authors if I have mispronounced their names. It was published in 2021 in the International Journal of Human Resource Management, and it was titled Back to Work Bang: Difficulties, Emotions, and Adjustment Strategies When Returning to Work After a Vacation. I love that title. I love that so much. I really like creative titles of things. And this is one way, in my opinion. I'm being so negative this morning. I'm just criticizing everything. I'm so sorry. But this is one way that I think SEO structures are kind of having a negative impact on things like paper titles, book titles, podcast names, because you want everything to be SEO optimized. You want your work to be found very easily when people pop it into Google. And the best way to do that is to give something a very plain name, to give something that is going to come up as one of those searchable keywords. Sadly, something like Back to Work Bang is probably not something that people are going to search for. And I'm going to leave that there. But I like that creativity behind it. I like when we have fun with language. I like when we just kind of show that talking about work, doing academic writing, it doesn't need to be dry and it doesn't need to be boring. I suppose, so long as you don't mind people not finding it and not being able to read it. But anyway, this was a qualitative study built on 93 individual interviews with working adults in Portugal across a range of sectors. So we've got administrators, we've got people in the hospitality industry, people in the healthcare industry, and educators. So it was a nice broad spectrum of people. And I wanted to use this study in particular because I think, again, like I've said, the returning to work literature and the teacher specific literature have quite a lot to say to each other. There's quite a good conversation to be had, there's a good discourse to be had. But as far as I can see, people are not pulling these things together. We tend to, again, keep ourselves as teachers in a little bit of a bubble because we do have this very unique situation of, in England, where I'm based, you go 8 weeks at the very most before you have a child-free week, let's call it, because again, quite often we will work through those half terms. And so we have this going back to work feeling more often than most other professions. But I think it's good to pull everything together because, again, the fact that each profession is idiosyncratic means that we are all very similar. And I think the more we look for those similarities instead of trying to push a narrative of difference, the better we're all going to be. Now, as I said about my show back in January, there is a lot of research focused on the need to take a break, the need for a holiday. And again, that whole show from the first Saturday in January of this year is about that. So please, like I've already said, go back and listen to that one if you're interested in, or if you're like me and don't take the holidays and do just work through them, you forget to take a break and you need to kind of justify to yourself why that's important. Then go back and listen to that one because I feel like there are some good points raised in the literature that I pulled together for that show. But like the researchers in this study, like Sosa and Gonsalves pointed out, there's a lot of research on the impact of holidays themselves, the benefits, the effect of burnout, how long those effects last. All of those things were covered back in my January show. But research on the actual return to work afterwards in any profession is scarce. They call it practically non-existent because everything, almost everything in the literature stops at the end of the holiday. And again, I think there's a lot that we can infer from that about our own relationships to going back to work, about the mask that we put on when we try and think about going back, about how it's socially acceptable to kind of complaining in jest about going back to work. Oh, I can't believe I'm going back tomorrow. But without actually facing any of the realities of it, without actually talking about what that process is like, what that adjustment is like. Through the researchers' 93 semi-structured interviews then, they asked directly how difficult these people found returning to work after taking at least 2 weeks off. They asked them to rate it on a scale of 1 to 6, and about 40% of their sample reported a real sense of difficulty. So they rated it either difficult, very difficult, or extremely difficult to go back to work, while a similar sized group found it not very difficult at all, and the rest were largely indifferent. So what we have, interestingly, isn't a universal experience. We've got a really interesting split. From the interview data, the researchers grouped the main difficulties people described into 4 distinct dimensions that we're going to kind of work through in brief now, and then we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. And it will be interesting for us sort of as I'm going through them, if we're worried about going back to work next week, to try and figure out which of these groups maybe best represents our feelings, our attitudes. You don't have to tell me, although feel free to if you would like to. But it might be an interesting sort of moment of self-reflection here on a Saturday morning. So the first group were the ones who faced work-related difficulties. So these are the people who struggled to get back into their routine, to keep up with their schedules, and who dreaded the idea of dealing with accumulated work that was waiting for them when they went back. One participant, whose pseudonym was Anna, said, it's difficult because after a few days of holiday without schedules, it's hard to get back to the daily routine. I think that was really interesting because a lot of the teachers that I've spoken to, just when you have chats about, oh, how was your holiday? Can you believe that we're back already? For a lot of people, getting back into the routine is seen as a positive thing. And I know that there are a lot of people who struggle from going from the very strict routinized days of school. You've got the bell telling you what to do and when, to having a lot of unstructured free time. So it'd be quite interesting to know how many teachers fall into that category versus how many teachers actually quite like getting back into the routine, getting back into the structure of knowing that your first lesson is at 9, then second lesson is at 9:45, then you've got break, and having your day timetabled for you. The second group were the ones who had difficulties at the social level. So they were dreading the reunions with colleagues, the readjustment to organizational culture, to organizational climate, and to changing habits that had shifted during the break. I found that one really interesting because, in my opinion, 2 weeks isn't a long time. And so I'm quite interested to know the professions. The study doesn't kind of break it down into this detail, but I would be interested to know the professions that undergo such big culture shifts in a fortnight that can contribute towards a dread of going back. I understand it for a longer term break. So, for example, if you are a parent going back after parental leave, perhaps after maternity leave, then I understand why that could be a concern. I also, and actually, I hadn't thought about this until just now. I suppose if you are going back and you've got a new head teacher, and so there is a huge um, habit shift there where you've got an unknown person coming in, bringing in their own experiences, their own routines, their own desires, and you're then facing that unknown. I suppose that could be quite anxiety inducing. But yeah, I feel like the social difficulties group are a really interesting one. Um, and I feel like there is a deeply intensified version of this for teachers, which again we will come back to a little bit later on. The third group were the ones who find it difficult to reconcile professional obligations and familial obligations. So they are the people who struggle with having less time and availability for their family, less time and availability for their leisure activities, for their hobbies, and straightforward feelings of fatigue. Fatima, one of the participants, described it as the return to the monotony of some tasks and the need to organize free time around work, which is a very interesting way of framing it, isn't it? That do we work to live or do we live to work question. And I think, let's be honest, in our profession, we know which way around it is. The fourth group, the one that I found conceptually the most interesting, and the one that I think gets the least amount of attention, sorry, just in casual conversation, were the back to work blues people. They were the ones who have a lack of identification with their colleagues, with their wider organization, which is caused specifically by the interruption of a shared history during an absence. So these might be the people whose going on holiday has coincided with something big happening at work. Maybe a culture shift, but maybe just an interesting event that happened, something really funny that happened, something that has bonded the people who were there, and you as the outlier is somebody who is left out. Now, again, as teachers, we tend not to get this one so much, I think, because we all take our holidays at the same time. But there's something to be considered for us in terms of things like sick leave or parental leave, where you go back and maybe your department has got a couple of additions to it, people whose coming into the department overlapped with your leaving, so they are already embedded, but you need to get to know who they are. And maybe you've been there 15 years and it feels, let's be honest, a bit of a bruise to the ego that you're going in and there are two people in your own department who don't know you because you're used to being the one who is known. Maybe it's that the place that you work in no longer aligns with your values. Maybe your values have changed. Maybe your workplace's values have changed. And so you feel disidentified with it. You no longer feel a part of that organization, a part of that school, a part of that college. And so there's this general sense of malaise when you're thinking about going back because you know that you are going into somewhere that you don't really feel like you belong. And I think that sense of belonging is really important. I did a show 3 weeks, 4 weeks ago on the importance of belonging for our young people. That was called Do We Belong Here? So if you're interested in that concept, please go and check that one out. But I think less attention has been given to the idea of teacher belonging. And again, it's because we are a job when it suits us being a job. You know, we think of it as this is our job, we just suck it up and get on with it. And then we are a calling and a vocation when it suits us being a calling or a vocation, or at least when it suits people who are talking about us for us to be a calling or a vocation. The researchers, just going back to this fourth group, connected this idea to the concept of a collective organizational memory. There's this idea that there is a shared history which is made up of meetings and conversations and small changes and inside jokes, and they happen whether you are there or not. Because organizations, schools, universities are made up of people, and people will continue to make connections. And so what will quite often happen is you will go back in after a period of sick leave, and you will find that something funny has happened, and there is a group of people who understand that joke because they were there. And maybe you feel a bit worried because you don't get that joke and you feel like an outsider. One participant, Claudia, described this anxiety when she said, what brings me the most anxiety is realizing what has changed in my absence and to know whether everything is the same and what the reactions of my colleagues will be. So for those people, it's more than just, oh, my inbox is full of emails, which can itself be anxiety inducing. It's not, oh, I don't really get on with my colleagues. If anything, it's, oh, I get on with my colleagues a lot and I'm worried that we're not going to have anything in common with them anymore. It's a lot more low level than that. And again, I think in teaching, that can happen when you are aware that there are very specific outside of school friendships happening, within your department. You know, if you know that in the maths department, the algebra teacher and the trigonometry teacher get on very, very well, and they have gone to the cinema every single Saturday together to watch a film because they are friends outside of school, then that can make you feel a little bit left out. Which is not to say that they are wrong for doing it, because you are allowed to have friends, and maybe you've got a friend in a different department that you go and do things with. So there's the kind of interpersonal aspect of it, the things that if our children came to us to talk about this, we might sit down and have a circle time with them about feeling left out and how that is, but that as adults we can quite often ignore. So if you are concerned about going back to work next week, it might be interesting to think about those four dimensions and consider which one you personally fall into, or if you are in a fifth dimension, a sixth dimension that this study didn't cover. So are you a work-related difficulties worrier, getting back into those routines, keeping up with your schedules? Are you a social worrier, reuniting with your colleagues, readjusting to the organizational culture? Are you a work-life balance worrier, scared that you're going to have to reduce your family time to go back to work? Or are you a back to work blues worrier, where you've got that feeling of lack of identification or of disidentification with your own workplace?
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, let's talk about the emotional aspect then of going back to work, because let's be honest, worrying about going back to work is an emotional reaction. And unless we kind of identify these emotions, unless we name them, we can be controlled by them. And I don't know whether this is a man thing or a British thing or a person thing, but I think sometimes it can be very easy to just try and ignore your emotions, to ignore how you're feeling about things like going back to work, and sort of hope that it will go away. If you don't think about it, then it will go away. But what I have found, again, specifically in terms of my own depression and anxiety, is that if you can identify what you are feeling, if you can name it, then you are more likely to be able to interrupt it. And that interrupting of negative emotion is really, really important. It prevents you from spiraling, it prevents you from ruminating, it prevents you from mulling. Then you can kind of deal with it if you want to. I know that there are some people who kind of like the back to work blues. There is something comforting about embracing the fact that you just feel rubbish about it. And so if you keep ignoring it, you can kind of keep feeling low key rubbish and just carry on with your routine. But I think I'm especially at this point talking to those of you who are perhaps overly concerned about going back to work. If you are willing to be brave and to name these emotions, to actually physically confront why you are feeling the way that you do, you are more likely to be able to deal with those feelings, which will improve your quality of life. Now, please keep in mind that I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a linguist. So what I'm saying right now just kind of comes from my own experience and the kind of reading around my own experience that I have done. And so always defer to somebody who is actually qualified in these things. But I do like to share my own experience where I can. For the researchers, for Sosa and Gonsalves, the feelings associated with going back to work split very cleanly into two facets. you've got the people who generally enjoy their work and they feel very rested when they go back. And the emotions that they reported were very positive. They reported joy, they reported relaxation, they enjoy the company of their colleagues, they felt serene, they felt enthusiastic, they felt curious. This is why inset right at the beginning of the academic year can actually be really helpful, even if all you want to do is get into your classroom and tidy and plan and all of that good stuff. Doing your CPD at the beginning of the year, if you've had a good, solid, restful summer holiday, actually makes a lot of sense because it means that you have that increased curiosity, that increased desire to learn, versus if it's done kind of right in the, slap bang in the middle of the autumn term when you're, let's say 14 weeks in and you can't quite see Christmas yet and you're exhausted. So there is a lot of positive things to be said for having your external speakers coming in right at the beginning of the year in that September inset, because maybe we will be more receptive to them. But those who find the adjustment harder, or who felt that the rest that they had had during their holiday wasn't enough, found themselves tipping negatively when it came to those emotions. They felt pressure upon going back to work. They felt demotivated. They considered themselves to be lazy. Now, whether that is objectively true or not, the study doesn't go on to say, but it's quite interesting that that was something that they felt about themselves. They reported themselves to be stressed, moody, nervous, and irritated. One participant, Joanne, described it as saying, "I deal with going back to work badly. I feel that I'm more grumpy, and I don't have any patience for the most varied tasks, even the simplest ones." And again, this is why I don't particularly want to drag down the teachers who are trying to build us all up for going back to work. Like the teacher influencer who posted the "remember there's a kid who's looking forward to seeing you" meme. Because some teachers will very much be looking forward to going back. And they are probably the ones who remembered to take the time over the summer to rest, to recharge, to actually have a holiday. They were the ones who were actively enjoying their time off instead of recovering from the school year. And I've not been able to find a study about this, but I think it would make an interesting one about whether the people who are less anxious, who are happier about going back to work in the new school year, are they also the people who tend to take more time off during the holidays during the year? So they are less prone to feeling burnt out by the time they get to July, which means that they're not spending their summer recovering from the year that has been, but they can spend their summer getting ready for the year that is coming, sort of building up those positive feelings to help take them back into the workplace. I think that'd be a really interesting thing for some researchers or for some action researchers to explore. Oh, amazing. So Teacher Fixel has said, "I'm starting teacher training this week, so feel saturated right now." Okay, let's take a bit of a pivot because we are flexible on Saturday breakfast. Let's see if we can give some advice about this. Saturated is a great way to conceptualize it, is a great thing to think about, because there is so much for you to take on board when you start your training, because you are doing a lot all at the same time. You are taking on board the training program itself, whether that's a PGCE or a BEd or a workplace-based scheme or whatever it might be, the academic part of the training, because there are a lot of academics to teacher training, and there should be. because in my opinion, a teacher should be research-based, research-informed, pedagogically informed, and so you should know the academics behind what you're doing. And you need to know what your assignment deadlines are going to be. You need to know what your portfolio deadlines might be, all of that stuff. And then you've also got the school side of it, where you are having to learn school routines, school systems, um, school expectations. And on top of that, you're in front of a class for the first time, which is also a huge thing. And it can be very overwhelming. It can be very saturating. And to be very honest, I would be concerned if anybody started their teacher training and they didn't feel that way. I would be concerned that either they hadn't kind of considered the reality of what they are about to walk into, or they hadn't been adequately prepared by school, university, wherever. So I'm going to say that it's horrible. It's a horrible feeling. But I'm kind of glad that you're feeling it, because for me at least, it means that you are aware of what's coming. But it's amazing. Um, I wouldn't still be in this profession. I'm about to go into year 19. And I very much would not still be here if it weren't an amazing profession. I didn't have the greatest time during my training. I really struggled, especially with my school placements. It took me a little while to feel like I had found my footing as a teacher. But when I did, that was sort of when I realized that it was absolutely what I was supposed to be doing. So I think that's probably my other piece of advice to you is, again, kind of like I said a few minutes ago, be very aware of how you're feeling. Take those feelings on board, sort of sit with them, understand them, and don't be afraid of them. Because how you feel about specific situations, maybe how you feel about doing a starter, because of course you are not going to go into your first lesson in practice and deliver an entire lesson. I started just by taking the register. I trained primary before transitioning to secondary, and the first thing that we had to do was take the register, and that was what we did. And then we sat and observed for the rest of the day. So maybe you'll do that. Maybe you will do a starter, and you might do the week's starters. Then you will build up, and you will do a half lesson, and then the teacher will take over and do the rest of it. It will be a nice gradual build up, but there's a lot of time for reflection, and there's a lot of time for thinking. And so just really be aware of who you are as a person, who you want to be as a teacher, and kind of start cultivating that teacher identity, that teacher version of you, because that's really, really important. Oh, my other piece of advice. Sorry, this is just turning into unsolicited advice hour. I do apologize. Make the most of observation. There will come a point, and again, this is going to depend on what kind of training program you're going into. There will come a point where observing people starts feeling really boring, and you feel ready to take the class, and you want to take the class, and you're itching to do it, but you're still sitting and observing. And I'm going to say, enjoy that observation process, because I would kill to be able to sit in other people's classrooms and observe them right now, just to observe their teaching, to learn from them. And I know that many other teachers, experienced teachers, those of us who have been doing it for a long time, feel the same way. When you are in practice, when you are employed, you don't get a lot of time to watch other teachers teach. So really make the most of it. If you are actually, no, I was going to break it up by phase, but it doesn't actually matter. see as many teachers as possible. If you're going into primary training, then, of course, the majority of your time will be spent with your class teacher, but ask if you can go and observe the teacher from the year above, the year below, the key stage below. Ask if you can go and spend an hour observing the reception teacher. If you are going in to be a geography teacher, ask if you can go and observe maths. Ask if you can go and observe French. Because the more you can see other teachers, the more techniques you will pick up, the more activities you will see, and you will go, oh yeah, that activity actually works really great for me. And yes, this is a maths activity, but I can 100% do this in my geography lesson. Or you will observe something and go, no, 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 that's not for me. That is not the way that I do something. I don't feel comfortable doing that. And sometimes that's an equally important reflection, because especially when you get given new pedagogies, you can feel very pressured to do all of the activities that come with that pedagogy. And some of them just don't work for you. I did a lesson once. It was a French lesson. I had the kids write sentences on a sheet of paper. The activity is called snowball. They had to crumple up the paper, throw it to kind of make a snow mound. Then they had to go and pick a piece of paper at random and translate whatever sentence was on the sheet of paper. Ideally, they wouldn't get their own, but sometimes they did. That's all fine. And I had a group of boys, and I asked them to throw their snowball pieces of paper at me. Now, I knew full well, bless them, these kids could not aim. So I knew that I was not going to be hit by these pieces of crumpled up paper. The kids thought it was funny that I was inviting them to throw their snowballs at me. I thought it was quite funny. But the teacher who was observing me was horrified that I had asked them to do that. And, we had a long conversation about it afterwards. And it kind of just boiled down to this idea that I was comfortable with X, Y, and Z. I thought it through. I knew where my boundaries were. I knew my relationship with that class, and I knew that everything was going to be fine. Teacher who was observing me didn't feel that way about any of their classes. So that particular activity staged in that particular way wasn't for them. And if you only observe one teacher, then you're going to assume that the way that that teacher does things is the way that you should do them. And if they do an activity in a way that you're not comfortable with, then you are probably going to try and force yourself to do that activity because you think that's the way it should be done. So yeah, try and see as many people as possible. If you are school-based, as you said, I know that that can be really difficult, particularly if you are school-based in employment, because you've probably only got your regular 10% non-contact time plus the additional 10% that you might get. So you might not have a huge reduction in your timetable, but where you can, plan to observe as many different teachers in as many different subjects settings as possible to really get a diverse view of how the profession is, how activities work, and really make sure that you can get the most out of it. And most importantly, good luck. It's going to be hard. I'm not going to pretend that it's not. But it is worth it. It is worth it. As long as you can keep in mind, oh, no, this is such a cliche. Keep in mind your why. Remember why you are doing it. Remember what your motivation is. Is it because you like working with kids? Is it because you love your subject and you want other people to love it? Is it because you are getting a £10,000 bursary and that money is helping you pay off your student loan from undergrad? Because that's also a reason that people go into teacher training. Whatever your why is, keep that in mind, because that will be what can keep you focused on days where it's feeling hard, on days where you are feeling down. Um, those days will come, and you are not less of a teacher for it.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
All right, so we'll go back to um, the original topic of the show, talking about going back after the holiday. But I do hope, Teacher Fixer, that you will stay. I love having you here as part of the Saturday Breakfast family. You know, I know that you've come for a few weeks now. You've commented. It's been great. I do hope that you will stick around, that you will come on Saturday mornings every week, and that you will let us know how you're getting on. Please don't ever worry about commenting. Please don't ever worry about asking questions there in the chat. I will always happily sort of pause whatever the topic is, to sort of respond to you and to check in and to keep you updated. And I'm sure that everybody else who is listening, if you have a question, then they will be more than happy to weigh in with ideas and advice as well. Teaching is a really solid, really strong community, and I think it's really important that we continue to build that. So the researchers went a step further. If you remember, we talked about those who had taken their break. They were going back in feeling joyful, feeling relaxed, having really positive feelings. Oh, Darren, that's awful English. Having really positive feelings about going back to work. Whereas those who hadn't taken a proper break were feeling that little bit more negative. And when the researchers probed this further and asked specifically what was generating the most anxiety, the answers were split again into two very distinct moments. There was the day before returning, or the moments before returning. So, you know, what we quite often call the Sunday scaries. And those first moments of actually arriving at work. So on the day before going back, the biggest anxiety triggers tended to be schedules, forgetfulness, and reuniting with colleagues. Once they actually got back to the workplace, the biggest triggers shifted to the accumulated work, organizing their tasks, a lack of ability to concentrate, their colleagues' reactions, and again, that very specific anxiety about not knowing what had happened while they were away. And I think there's a really good practical insight that's buried deep in that split, because the anxiety that you have before you go back and the anxiety that you have once you've actually got into your classroom are not the same, even though they are triggered by the same thing. And that itself can be really, really worrying, because now you're sitting there thinking, Darren, come on. I came to this show with one anxiety about going back to work, and now you've given me two. But I think, again, if we're very honest about how we're feeling, if we name these feelings, if we are aware of them, and if we're aware of what they actually are instead of what we think they are, then we are better able to deal with them. So that night before is an anticipatory dread, and it's a dread about the unknown. Have things changed? Will I remember how all this works? Do I remember what my password is? That itself, you know, it's a small thing, and it doesn't even register as anxiety. It's something that we quite often make jokes about, but it is something that adds to that cognitive load of going back to work. And as we know, as we've talked about on the show before, adding to your cognitive load adds to your anxiety, because the less brain space you have essentially to process your feelings, because your brain is being taken up with things like, do I remember my password? The less you are able to process your feelings, and so the more they kind of build up. So a reduction in cognitive load helps you to face your going back to work anxieties. And this is why, as much as you might not want to think about it, doing things like, and again, this sounds trite because it's the advice we give to the kids, but doing things like packing your bag the night before, or even having your bag packed already. Because let's be honest, we've got today, tomorrow, Monday's a bank holiday, maybe you're back for inset on Tuesday. You might not be doing very much over the next 3 days. You might be getting ready. So there is nothing wrong with kind of packing your pencil case and your laptop and whatever else might need to be packed ready. Maybe don't pack your lunch yet. That would be a bit disgusting by the time you get to Tuesday lunchtime. But do that to reduce that cognitive load. Make yourself a to-do list. I was always a person that would put off thinking about it. I'm saying that in the past tense in case you're new to the show. I now teach at an online school, and we actually don't get holidays. Not in the same way. My holidays, it kind of works a bit like a regular job where I just take my holiday when I want to take a holiday, and I let my students know that I'm not available for lessons. So I don't have this same issue at the moment. But yeah, I used to hate the idea of thinking about going back to work before I actually had to do it. But if I had known then what I know now, I would have absolutely sat down, maybe at the beginning of that last week off, made myself some to-do lists to reduce that cognitive load before going back, so that I could then deal with whatever feelings I was feeling. The moment that you then are actually back, that anxiety becomes very concrete and it becomes task-based. So it's the classroom that you have to sort out. It's the inbox that you have to deal with. It's that first lesson that you have to go and teach. And that distinction is really important, of course, because you might need two very different sets of coping strategies in order to get through them. And the researchers frame all of this through a well-established piece of psychological theory. So just in case you think that this is just me as a linguist extrapolating on psychology, there is actually something in this. It's called the affective circumplex model, which was proposed by Howard Schlossberg and was developed further by James Russell. And it essentially organizes emotional experience along two dimensions. You've got valence, which is how pleasant or unpleasant something feels, and you've got activation, which is about how energized or how flat something feels. And if you map your feelings about going back to work on this model, then at least in terms of this study, the participants' return to work emotion, it covers the full range, because you've got some pleasure without much activation. So that's when you feel serene about it. You've got pleasure with high activation. That's actual happiness and enthusiasm about going back to work. You've got displeasure without activation. So that's sadness, low mood, depressive feelings. And then you've got displeasure with high activation. So that's stress, it's pressure, it's nervousness. And again, I think that that's a really interesting frame for helping you to name and deal with exactly how you are feeling, because where you fall on that spectrum might be different to how your partner, who is also a teacher, or your parent, who is also a teacher, feels, and where they sit on that spectrum. Because I now realize, after doing the research for this show, that I was one of those displeasure with high activation people, because I felt stressed, I felt pressured, I felt nervous about going back to work, because I the idea of going back to work felt unpleasant because I like being at home. I like being on holiday. Um, but I'm usually quite energized about going back to work because I do actually like teaching. And it's a very odd mix of feelings, and I didn't ever understand it. But now that I can conceptualize it in those terms of being, um, what was it? Displeasure but high activation, I understand why I felt stressed, pressured, and nervous. And again, if I can go back 3 years ago, even just before I transitioned to online learning, and I could explain that to myself, then it would have made a whole lot more sense in terms of how I felt about going back to work, and I would have dealt with it much, much better. So, not every hard return to work feeling is the same shape. Everything gets lumped together as Sunday scaries. I'm not looking forward to going back to work on Tuesday, but not everybody's feelings are the same. Now, the last bit, we're gonna think about us as teachers specifically, um, because we were included within this sample. It was only a small number of teachers. It was 8 educators out of the 93 participants, which I personally think is too small of a subgroup from which to draw conclusions. And, this wasn't the aim of the research anyway. But I do think it's important to look at what they were talking about because this is our profession and it's interesting to see what other educators think. So, one education professional, how they worked in education wasn't very clear. So I'm just going to say education professional. I might lapse and say teacher, but I mean education professional. They said, I try to focus on work to start to prepare the lessons, to try to anticipate what might happen so that I feel prepared. And that's something we are trained to do. As teachers, we are trained to anticipate. I don't know about you, but I remember when I was training, um, and remember this was 20 odd years ago because I did a 3-year B.Ed. So hopefully they've got rid of this now. But one of the things that I had to do was write on my lesson plan questions that I thought the children might ask. And the idea behind that was so that I would be prepared for it, so that I would have answers, so that I would not be caught off guard. And I think probably to train us in the fact that kids are going to ask questions. They might not be relevant to the lesson plan, they might not be relevant to what we're talking about. And am I equipped to be able to deal with that? But it was a guessing game because I'm not psychic. So I didn't know what questions they were going to ask. And you can't always anticipate what somebody is going to ask you. Some things you can anticipate, particularly if you have been teaching for a long time and you know that the same questions come up. But hopefully, at that point, you've worked it into your PowerPoint, your worksheet, whatever it might be, so it's not a question anymore. We're taught a lot to anticipate in education, to think about what could go wrong and how we're going to mitigate it. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do those things because we need to be prepared for things to go wrong. But sometimes I think we anticipate a bit too much. And sometimes I think that we convince ourselves that anticipating issues is going to solve them. But in fact, all it's going to really do is frame us negatively towards whatever we're going into because we're already going into it assuming that something is going to go wrong. Now, again, I'm coming to this conclusion as somebody with a diagnosed anxiety disorder. So, some of the therapy that I did when I was going through that was about recognizing what is useful anticipation and what is, in fact, just my anxiety telling me lies, essentially, telling me that things were going to go wrong when they weren't. And again, while I don't want to kind of cast blame on that, I do wonder how much of my training to be anticipatory kind of fed into that. It's really interesting to think about. Um, but anyway, I'm a little bit, I don't know. I suppose I'm a little bit concerned about this teacher's strategy of trying to focus on work, preparing the lessons, that's great, and anticipating what might happen so that they feel prepared. I think, hmm, okay, all right. So I'm now second guessing myself because I think feeling prepared does do a lot to mitigate negative feelings, doesn't it? I think if you can go into something feeling confident, feeling prepared, then you are going to feel good about it, or at least you're going to feel less anxious about it. I just, I'm not sure of the value of this anticipation. I don't know, is my answer to that one. Quite honestly, I don't know. Um, I suppose it's one of those different strokes for different folks moments, isn't it? Where we have to remember that as teachers, we're not a monolith. Everybody has to do what is right for them. For me, overthinking what a day might look like, what a day is going to bring, is not going to be very helpful at all because it would prompt me to spiral. But for this teacher, it must work, otherwise, they wouldn't do it. And this is, I'm all about the literature. This is one of the issues with dealing with the literature as um, as in depth as we do here, is that we have to remember that for the vast majority of the time, these things are transferable, but there will be individual cases where they're not. But it's important to not blow that out of proportion and assume that just because nothing is 100% transferable 100% of the time, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have worth and it doesn't have value. Welcome to Darren's thought process on a Saturday morning. Okay, so how can we help ourselves? How can we reduce that dread? How can we reduce those moments of anxiety about facing what's going to happen on Tuesday, on Thursday, whenever you are going back in? For the general household and family side of the transition, the dominant strategy reported in this study by far was straightforward, advanced organization, meal planning, laying out your shirt and tie the night before, shopping ahead of time, sharing tasks across the household rather than one person absorbing all of it. Rita, one of the participants, described it very simply as I organize everything in advance, my meals, my shopping, and my clothes. Yulia said, I usually distribute household chores amongst my family. Everybody has to help. So it's just about that advanced organization, that advanced planning. For the work side specifically, the near universal strategy was setting clear priorities and tackling the most overdue work first rather than trying to absorb everything simultaneously. Manuela said, first things first, very simply. Now, again, for us, that's ever so slightly different because you kind of go into the new year with a clean slate. But realistically, the first lesson that you should plan should be the first lesson that you're going to deliver, whether that's tutor time or you're going straight into curriculum, whatever it might be. It makes sense for you to have the first, at least your very first lesson up and ready to go. I always used to like doing my first 2 days having those completely ready. I didn't worry about like my year group sequencing or anything like that. I just had my first 2 days ready to go so that I could then spend my planning time where I might be planning for those 2 days, getting everything else ready. But again, this is idiosyncratic. This is whatever is going to work best for you. Katrina, one of the education professionals, said, "I try to focus on work." Oh yeah, we read that one. To start preparing my lessons to anticipate what might happen so that I feel prepared. And that quote is sitting directly at the intersection of the specific anxiety triggers that Sosa and Gonsalves identified, that pre-return anxiety about the unknown and that arrival day anxiety about disorganization and lack of preparation. And so rather than trying to suppress or to distract from that anxiety, what Katerina was doing is addressing the source of the anxiety directly, reducing that uncertainty through advanced preparation. I think this is kind of what I was trying to say before, that she was understanding that for her specifically, knowing what was coming, addressing, anticipating any issues that might come, was directly addressing the specific anxiety that she felt. And it just so happened that the anxiety that she felt mapped quite beautifully onto the anxieties experienced by the 92 other participants in this study. Interestingly, out of the 93 total participants, 21 of them reported having no strategy at all for managing the return to work. Among those who did have a coping response, the most commonly named one was resignation. Now, to be clear, because it took me a moment to realize what they were talking about, they weren't going to hand in their resignation. They weren't quitting their jobs, as tempting as that might seem. They were resigning themselves to the fact that they felt a little bit rubbish about going back to work. And I think that amongst teachers, that's probably the one that we also experience, isn't it? We know that we're going back to work. We know that we're going into inset. We can't deny that. We don't have a nice little pocket watch that will stop time for us. Tuesday is coming. The worst thing that we can do is nothing and not be prepared for it. And I think the reason that so many people in this study weren't prepared and they were just resigned to the fact that they were going back to work is because it's uncomfortable to recognize that you're uncomfortable with it. It can feel unprofessional to say, actually, I'm a little bit stressy about going back to work. I don't really fancy it. Especially if you are met with what could be deemed toxic positivity or the guilt trip of you're doing it for the kids. We straddle this really interesting line between being able to be real people and have negative emotions and recognize that we don't always feel great about going back to work, and then having to be the public perception of teachers where of course we love it, of course we're there for the kids because that's what everybody thinks, because everyone has been to school and hopefully the vast majority of us had teachers who cared about us and who made us think that all teachers care 100% about their kids and about their job 100% of the time. But the worst thing that I think we can do is sit in denial of going back to work, as tempting as that might be, because all it does is it makes you ruminate and it makes you a bit more stressed. Whereas if you actually head on confront why you're feeling what you feel, name it, think about it, and take action to mitigate those feelings, to cancel those feelings out, to deal with them, we're going to have a much nicer quality of life. Because as everybody likes to tell us, we get loads of holidays. And if you're going to spend, what's it going to be? So going back after the summer, going back after autumn half term, going back after Christmas, going back after spring half term, going back after Easter, going back after summer half term. 6. We have 6 going back to work days, plus Sundays and whatever else. Do you want to spend that many days of your life, of your career, feeling anxious, feeling scared, feeling worried? I did. And now that I don't anymore, I wish that I hadn't done that. And I wish that I had been brave enough to face my feelings head on and go, this is how I feel, this is how I'm dealing with it. You deserve that peace of mind. So thank you as always for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed the show. I hope you found the investigation, the paper as interesting as I did. I'm sorry that you had to sit through that little segment of me second guessing my own thoughts and feelings on the subject. This is how you know that we're live, at least. And this is how you know that we interrogate the literature, that your feelings about something that you have read will change, can change, do change. Hopefully not live on air, but sometimes. And yeah, I think that is a good thing for us to be aware of. Tim has very kindly messaged, "We think you're great," from 2 non-teachers. Well, do you know what? I think that that you and that everybody who spends their Saturday morning with me are great too. I really, really do appreciate you all. So thank you so much for being here with me today. Have a great weekend. Whatever you are doing, however you are naming your anxiety and dealing with it, I hope that it is productive. I hope that it is fun. I will be back next Saturday when we will celebrate having survived our first week back. But until then, have a great week. Thank you very much and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.